Hello, welcome back to the Matt Phifer Experience. I am your host, Matthew Phifer, and today we have on a very special guest. You know how we get down here, we like to bring on people that I would recommend myself, or someone that I would use myself, or I recommend to my own friends and family. And today we have on Shan Potts, and he is an attorney out of Glendale, California, immigration and a criminal defense attorney. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation. I think he's a wealth of knowledge and has a lot of experience that I think that he's going to be able to help you and your situation out with. With all that being said, I don't want to take up all of our guest time. So Shan, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started.
Well, I've been doing this for a very long time. It kind of got started because I was interested in different cultures, interested in different languages, and I kind of fell into it. And I didn't intend on being an immigration attorney or a criminal defense attorney. I just kind of gravitated to it because of circumstances. And it's just been a blessing in my life, and it's been a calling, and I get to help people, and I grow through it as well. So that's how I kind of got started. It's been a long process.
Great. And so you say that you kind of fell into it. What was it? And so and obviously the language that you just mentioned, but what were some things that, what were your early cases like? How did you actually get started?
I went to law school in the evening, so I had the opportunity to work at a nonprofit, and it's here in Southern California. They dealt with immigration issues in Central America. So I traveled to Central America. I was an international election observer, and when I came back to the States, I continued to work for the organization and primarily focus on political asylum cases. There were individuals from Central America, primarily El Salvador, and they were applying for asylum, and I helped them navigate through that process, doing their asylum applications, and then that just kind of introduced me to immigration, and then I've just been doing various aspects of immigration since. That includes criminal issues within immigration. Those who have been in the criminal justice system, I help them to kind of remedy those situations.
And there's I think there's a lot of stigma, obviously, with immigration, with immigrants, and I think that one of the stigmas, and I think that some of the things that aren't talked about along with those stigmas, is that that they plan on getting married or plan on having children just to try to get citizenship, those sorts of things. I'm sure that those type of things happen, but also there's times where they genuinely fall in love and genuinely, meet someone, genuinely have children and those sorts of things. Can you talk a little bit about those stigmas?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what we see in the media, who we think is an immigrant. But in my experience, most of my clients have been here for 10, 20, 30 years. They have children, they have grandchildren, they have U.S. citizen spouses or partners. And only a small percentage are people who are just recently arrived. Those families are just well seated, and they're legitimate families. You're gonna with any population, you're always gonna find every issue, but I don't see that as a predominant issue. And the way that the immigration process works, it'll be, not that it doesn't happen, but it's kind of difficult to enter into a sham marriage and then from that gain immigration status. So does it happen? Yes. I think the government is really well equipped to kind of detect those things, and so I've rarely seen it in the last 20 years. But I do recognize it's a possibility. But I think that's just more of this myth that's out there that is pervasive. I don't find it to be pervasive whatsoever.
Right. Now, with that being said, when it comes to marriage, I mean, obviously the divorce rate is over 50%. I don't know what the rate is specific to immigrants, but I do know that people who are in those type of situations, who are in those type of marriages, if it goes south, oftentimes can find themselves being taken advantage of because of sometimes the language barrier, Sometimes they may not find an attorney who speaks the language or doesn't speak it very well. Sometimes they're afraid of even speaking up because of their status, and even if their status is okay, sometimes, especially if they have an abusive spouse, might make them feel or might convince them that something bad is going to happen to them. Deportation. They're never going to see their kids again. They don't have rights. Those sorts of things. Can you speak to that a bit and some things that maybe you've seen and maybe you've heard?
Actually, what you're mentioning, I see quite a bit. It's very common. What I see is, well, let me explain how the process works. So when you get married and your spouse petitions you, you can become a resident, and depending on how long you've been married, you'll get like a permanent resident status or a conditional resident status, and then eventually that becomes permanent, and then after several years you can become a citizen. Unfortunately, what happens sometimes, people are in abusive relationships, psychologically abusive, physically abusive. There are protections for those people. There's something called the Violence Against Women's Act, and it's VAWA, excuse me, and it allows people who find themselves in that situation to ask for an additional protection, so they don't have to stay in that relationship. They can get protection from an abusive spouse, and that's both men and women. There's also something called a U visa, and there's a visa that's available for people who are victim of a crime, victims of abuse. So there are all these ways that people can protect themselves, but that requires knowledge. that requires being able to speak to someone and getting the right advice and so forth. But what you're describing, I don't think it's pervasive, but it does happen, and I do see it happen. And I have clients who have been in dysfunctional relationships or abusive relationships, and they have options. So they're not. Some people feel trapped in a relationship. They feel that they're going to be turned over to immigration officials, or they're going to be abandoned. But there are options for those people. But I think a lot of times, whether or not it's the immigrant population or just the general population, I think the people, being able to find someone they can speak with professionally, and people feel like they have options. So it's just speaking to the right person.
Well, what would you say is the most common situation that they find themselves in? Is it the former or soon-to-be former significant other convincing them that they're going to be deported? Is it that, that they just don't have rights? What would you say maybe like just the most common three things that you see for someone who might be listening and like, maybe I fall into this, maybe I don't?
Well, for those people who are in new marriages and they have that conditional status that I explained, I think when they find themselves in a situation that's functional, they think that they're trapped. And they think I have to stay in this marriage, or I have to succumb to the demands of my partner, or I feel like I'm going to be trapped, I'm going to be deported, or I'm going to, so that's not true. There's if the marriage, as long as the marriage is bona fide when you entered into it, you can ask for your immigration status. You're not compelled to remain in that relationship. That's one scenario. I don't see that often, but I do see that. The most common scenario I see is just domestic violence. You can see it, across the spectrum. I see that a lot, and I see it with men as well as women. Not men as much, but I do see that, and I think that's kind of universal, whether or not it's a non-citizen or citizen. People feel that they don't have anywhere to go, but immigration law specifically has protections for victims of domestic violence. But you have to know that exists, and you have to know that option exists. I also see people who are accused of domestic violence as a weapon. I see men accused of domestic violence as a weapon. I've seen females as well, but I've seen men accused, and in the criminal justice system, they plead to these offenses, and later the other partner will recant, but at that point they've already convicted. And that puts them in a really dangerous situation. because once the criminal justice system gets involved and once they are convicted, that is a ground of deportation. They can be deported for that. And it's kind of really it's difficult to untangle that. And so I see that quite a bit. In addition to helping immigrants with their immigration scenario, I also help them to clear, wrongful convictions. And that kind of ties into this issue as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something, that's something I definitely want us to chime in on. Are these false allegations? Because I think that there's a perception that, we hear it especially on social media, that if someone is being accused of something, that you should just automatically believe the victim. And I want to be very sensitive because, we obviously know that there are real actual victims out there, but for people who don't know, people who are listening, sometimes the person who is in control and the person who is abusive is the one who's actually making the accusation and eliciting, and it's called not financial abuse. It's called legal abuse, where they're actually using the legal system as a way of power and control over someone. So how often would you say that something like that happens?
I as an attorney, I never try to put myself in the position of knowing what actually happened in that circumstance, because you get a set of facts in front of you, and obviously that's not the whole story, and you get one person's version of the story, another person's version of the story. Only God and the individuals who were there know what happened. So I really don't. That's not something that guides me in kind of resolve a person's situation. What I see is couples who may be in dysfunctional relationships, and they use the criminal justice system. They'll call the authorities on their partner, and they have they use it as leverage. I see that. It is not my interpretation of the circumstance. I actually have the spouse saying, "You know what? I got angry, and that's a weapon for me." And then later they regret calling the authorities. But at that point, it's already, the damage has been done. So in those circumstances, I have a couple, and they're saying, we're in a rough patch, and one used the authorities against the other, and now they kind of regret it, and the entire family is suffering. So I do see that. And unfortunately, even if the partner writes an affidavit or declares or testifies that no, that didn't happen, what I also witness is that prosecuting officers, there's domestic violence units, they still prosecute those cases. And when I go into court and I try to undo those cases, it's difficult. It's difficult. We have to look for other ways to help those individuals. So, I don't get into, people who are victimized, they should be heard. And like, we really don't know where the truth lies. I just think people should be heard. And you see all kinds of scenarios. My job is really to make sure that people know their rights, people know their options, and people have a chance to kind of be heard. And then the outcome and the truth of the matter will present itself. I don't try to navigate what's true or what's not true. I don't put myself in that position, just to protect people's rights and let them know what their options are. And unfortunately, like all humans, I just see a lot of dysfunctional things that, people are not, they're not, in a relationship, you have to be prepared for that. And when we're not, we just get ourselves in these really unfortunate situations with violence, abuse, psychological abuse, using the legal systems against one another. And I'm seeing it all.
Right. Absolutely. One of the things that you mentioned before we hit record was preparing before you enter into a marriage or before you get into a relationship, and to hopefully avoid these type of situations to begin with. What would you say are some ways that someone could prepare, or, are there things that someone could see in someone that maybe that they're dating that it could potentially lead down this type of path where it's like, well, I don't need to continue down this path? Or or just in your own words, what are some ways that someone can prepare to make sure they can avoid these type of situations?
Well, from a legal perspective, we're talking about non-citizens. From a legal perspective, just getting the right counsel, just know what my options are, how as a couple we can help our partner to gain legal status. And then also speaking about what happens if the relationship doesn't work out, what are my options? And I know people don't like to speak about this, but what happens if there's abuse, or what happens if there's abandonment? What are my options? And also help people with prenuptial agreements and post.
I was just about to ask about prenups, especially with immigrants. If that, we talk about prenups all the time here, but I don't think, going back to what you mentioned in terms of rights, I don't think that someone who might have an immigration status potential issue or question marks, they may not feel like they have a right to it. I'll let you speak to that, and
Well, I actually took quite a few. I have couples who, when you're not in this circumstance, when both individuals have status in the United States, they're citizens of the United States or have status in the United States, they don't really contemplate it. They take it for granted. People get in relationships. Sometimes the relationships don't work out, and then they find themselves in this chaotic dissolution, divorce situation, and now they're trying to figure out things. But what I find is that people who are a non-citizen and they're trying to figure out how can we get married and how can we help my partner get it, I think they're actually more in tune to asking those legal questions. And because we're U.S. citizens and we find someone we want to marry, we just get married and we just kind of deal with it. Once things happen, we deal with it at that moment. But if your partner is not a citizen, one conversation is about the marriage. The other conversation is about how do I have my wife apply for her green card. So you're having that legal conversation at that point. And I think a lot of us, U.S. citizens, we don't necessarily have those conversations because we just get married, we go to the church, we have a party, But there's like a legal conversation that you have when your partner is not a citizen. Like, okay, now how am I able to help my partner? How am I able to help him or her to get their legal status? So they're in that room and they're having that conversation. Now, as an attorney, not only am I advising them, okay, once you get married, then you can file for a visa, then you can file for your residency. But let's also talk about prenuptial agreements. People don't want to hear that. Let's talk about the pros and how that helps you and how that can be strengthened in your relationship. Let's talk about domestic violence and VAWA. Let's talk about all these other things that you should at least be informed about. And we don't wish that on anyone, but you should have that information. So if these things happen, you know what your rights are. I never found that information was a negative, whether or not we use it. Information is always a positive.
Yeah. What about when people go through a divorce situation like this, and someone has an immigration status question mark, for lack of better terms, and they share children? Is it still a possibility that they could get full custody or 50-50, or is it just, a given that the other parent is just going to win because of those situations?
Well, the whole issue concerning family law, dissolution, and custody, those are state issues. And what they're looking for, their standard is the best interest of the child. And depending on what state you're in, it's community property. So those are state issues. Now, whether or not the person has status or doesn't have status, those are kind of independent things, unless the fact that they don't have status may not be in the best interest of the child, right? But if that individual has applied for their green card, then I don't think that's really an issue. I don't think that in most cases, I'm not saying 100%, but in most cases, whether or not one parent is a U.S. citizen and the other one isn't, as long as there's no issues of abuse and there's no issue that the fact that the non-citizen parent is not in the best interest of the child, I don't think that immigration status is a major factor.
Right.
It can be like if the person has no status or they're subject to deportation. It can be, but that's rare. That's not very common.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's great. I think for a lot of people, there's going to be a sense of relief,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that they, might need to go through a divorce,
Mm-hmm.
and unfortunately, people deal with that. I know that there's a lot of people going back to something you mentioned earlier, where they're just afraid of even talking to an attorney, even getting consultation,
Mm-hmm.
because of these things. They're afraid of, getting in trouble and those sorts of things. Can you talk a little bit about like consult? You mentioned before finding the right representation. How does someone know if someone has the potential to be the right representation, the right counsel for them?
You know what? That's something I taught. I have attorneys who work with me, and I try to mentor them as well. But that's something that's just your instinct. So many times when we go into an attorney's office or an accountant or a doctor, there's this relationship where one person they're not having a conversation, and it's a lot of my clients, if they're from certain parts of the world, they'll call me Dr. Potts because that's what they call their attorneys in their countries. And I respect that. I enjoy that. But I try to create a conversation. And a lot of times, I try to ask them something about something they have a unique knowledge on so I can gain something so I can empower them. And then I share what I know. So I try to make a mutual exchange. But that's just about as an individual sitting in front of someone and you have that sense of confidence in, and you have that sense of that you can have a communication. And I think the client or the individual owes it to themselves to be prepared before they even walk in the office. And I think the attorney, if he's living up to his responsibilities, owes it to his clients. Just not speak at your client, but have a conversation. But that's just something in all walks of life that, you got to be a good student and you got to be a good teacher. I think both have to come in prepared. It's very, very common, unfortunately, that people say, hey, you're the attorney, you tell me what to do, where do I sign? And that's an invitation for disaster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Shan, you are a wealth of knowledge. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you being here. I think that people have learned so much today. For people who are listening, people who might want to work with you, people who might want to refer you to friends and family members, what's the best place for them to reach you and find you at?
I think the quickest way is up through our website. It's my name, SHAN. It's the ShanPottsLawOffice.com. And that's the best way to reach me.
Awesome. Well, if you are listening to this or if you are watching this on YouTube, you can go down into the show notes and all of his information will also be there. And also go over to his social media, show him some love. Make sure you comment down below a takeaway that maybe you've taken away from today, something that you've learned from today's episode that maybe you didn't know before. Make sure you give him some follows. Make sure you guys also refer him out to your friends and family members. If you guys find people who are in situations that you feel like they need some help. With all that being said, thank you very much. And I will see you in the next episode. You guys have a great one.
Much appreciated. Thank you.